All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Robert Jones. We're here to talk about the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC. I've got a couple of my colleagues. You'll see there Scott Dawson and Andrew Streetman. The title for today was "It Takes a Village to Tackle CMMC and Cybersecurity." And what we want to show, and I think what you'll pick up throughout today's webinar, is this is more than just your IT person or IT department. It's more than your outsourced IT firm that you might be using, like a managed service provider. But there really is multiple people, both internally and externally, that are involved in obtaining and maintaining the appropriate cybersecurity credentials or certification that you need. Again, my name is Robert Jones. Our firm is Left Brain Professionals. Many of you know us. We're a boutique accounting firm. We practice primarily accounting system design, implementation, and audit support. And part of the reason that CMMC is important to us and why we're bringing this to you is we only work with government contractors, and we know the government contractors out there are dealing with the cybersecurity requirements in their contracts. And then the other reason it's important to us as accountants, and not just government contract accountants, but as accountants in general, we're always concerned about internal controls, the financial control around, or the controls around the financial system. And as accountants, we're helping you with your accounting software, hardware, network, the apps that you're using, cloud services. So it's always a big concern for us. We realize that even for us trying to help you with it, that it takes more than what we can provide as a firm, that we needed other people. So that's where Scott Dawson and the Core Solution come in. And I'll let each of them introduce themselves in a moment. And Andrew Streetman with Vision Technology. So Scott, if you want to share your little tidbit.
Yeah, glad to do it, Robert. Hey, thank you for the introduction and opportunity to join you here today. Core Business Solutions is a management consulting firm located here in Pennsylvania, working with small businesses around the US. And as companies need to wrestle with compliance, we're there to help. CMMC is a big wrestling match. Shall we say it that way, Robert? And so this is the tag team. I think that's what we are. We're the tag team to wrestle this thing to the ground. But I'm really glad to meet you. Andrew?
There we go. Sorry about that, everybody. My name is Andrew Streetman. I'm President and CEO of Vision Technology Solutions. We're based out of Columbus, Ohio. Been in business since 1996. We work with small, medium businesses with all their IT needs, traditionally known as a managed service provider, and also evolving to be a managed MSSP as well. But what we bring to the table is a vast experience in actually implementing controls and making sure that you can meet those criteria from an IT and technology perspective. And like I said, the great thing about the three of us here is we cover each of those bases so that we can make your life easier. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Andrew. So let me just touch on the agenda here today. We'll talk briefly about where all this came from. It's actually not new. It's just in a new format in some regards. And who does it apply to? And then we'll get into details about the various level requirements, timeline, and then we'll touch on costs toward the end. I think that's probably the biggest question people have is, you know, how long is this going to take and what's it going to cost me? And we'll try to at least put some parameters around those two questions as we go through. So we'll start here with a little bit of background. And Robert, I think I'll pick on you here to maybe talk about the regulations, where they've been, where they're going, where they came from.
Sure. So if you're doing business with the federal government, most everybody, and we always have to say most everybody at the federal government, you're dealing with the FAR. We do have to remember there are some agencies and offices within the federal government who don't follow the FAR. They may have their own requirements out there, so that's something always to keep in mind, not only with CMMC, but with any aspect of your contract. But generally, when you're dealing with the government, you're dealing with the FAR. The basic FAR clause here has been included in contracts for a number of years. It's the basic safeguarding of covered contractor information systems. One thing to note is that the FAR clause deals with systems, whereas when we talk about the DFARS clause, we're talking about data and protecting the data. You'll note here that the FAR clause includes 17 basic cyber practices to protect FCI or federal contract information. And these are the things, if you go back, I always like to insert the little tidbit. Go back to the Federal Register when the FAR Council released this rule. They said these are the things that prudent businesses should already be doing to protect their own systems, not even just because you're dealing with the government, right? So the stuff that, and Andrew is going to have an opportunity to talk about a couple of those items in a little bit. You should be doing these things already to protect your data, regardless of the fact that you're doing business with the government. Now, the next rule there, the DFARS, if you're doing business with DOD, you're probably familiar with the DFARS and this specific clause. I also like to say that sometimes we get other people on these calls. They say, well, I'm not really doing business with DOD right now. Why do I care about CMMC and the cybersecurity stuff? There are a couple of reasons. One, as I said, even just a moment ago, talking about some agencies who don't follow the FAR, or even other agencies that do, but they have their own additional requirements. For example, we've seen that GSA is already trying to leverage the CMMC requirements outside of DOD. If you're dealing with HHS or somebody else, they may have their own set of rules. The other really important reason is that those of us in the contracting community, I'll say no and pretty much expect that over time, and we don't know when that is, this DFARS rule will eventually flow into the FAR, and everybody who's doing business with the government, regardless of agency or office, is going to end up following the same rule. It's just that right now it's rolling out with the Department of Defense.
Yeah, and Robert, I guess I would add to that, if you don't mind, that there are state and local governments that are watching this carefully. There are foreign governments that are collaborating with the DoD in regards to cybersecurity requirements. I think the aim is to have a unified requirement that the contractor would have one thing they have to be in compliance with rather than several things they have to be in compliance with pertaining to cybersecurity. And Andrew, you'd probably be glad to hear that, because it ends up with three-headed monster if you're not careful with these different things that conflict and all that. But I think that's where they're headed with it. If anyone is interested in reading more on the details of these, I've added links on most of the slides where you guys can get back to the regulation if you really can't sleep tonight. Yeah. So Robert, let's talk just briefly about these acronyms that we tossed out there, FCI and CUI.
Yeah, so FCI is Federal Contract Information. It's information that's not intended for public release. It's provided or generated by the government under a contract to develop or deliver a product or service to the government. Again, this is not publicly available information, right? And so the government wants you to protect it. That's, as it says here, is the focus of CMMC Level 1. CMMC Level 1, as we'll talk a little bit later, really aligns with that FAR clause that we just talked about. There's 17 basic requirements. There's really a one-to-one relationship there. And again, what did I say about the FAR clause, right? It's the stuff you should be doing to protect your own basic information. And so the government says, right, there's some very basic kind of information in our contracts that we want you to protect, whether it's CUI or not. Yep. And that takes us to the next item here, where it is, so what is CUI? CUI is controlled unclassified information. The DFARS clause really hones in on CUI, the CMMC certification stuff that we'll talk about, especially at the level 3 and higher, hones in on the CUI. So this is that extra special stuff. I also want to clarify here, we're talking about classified data. If you're working on contracts that have classified data, that's managed by the NISPOM. You're not going to commingle that data here. It's not going to be on these systems. There's a whole other set of requirements that you need to follow. That said, there are certainly some interesting parallels in how we think about security around those types of things. If you want to know more about CUI, Scott's again got the registry there. The thing that I would tell you, when we talk about CUI, most people think of PII, or personally identifiable information, right? Things like your date of birth, your social security number, your driver's license number. People think about PHI, or protected health information. Those are the ones that come to mind for a lot of people. Depending on the agency that you deal with, the type of products or services that you provide, there are actually, and I went back and counted at one point, I think there's 124 categories and subcategories of CUI, of different types of data. And you need to know, you need to go in there and read about those types of data that may be related to what you do, because there are some individual marking and dissemination kind of stuff that you need to be aware of when we talk about CUI.
Yeah, well, wouldn't it be nice, Robert, in a perfect world, that the government actually marked this stuff? Hey, this is CUI. So what about this issue of marking?
So I know it's an interesting question, and that's the thing that, so I've been following, and I've actually been teaching. I've developed a couple of courses on cybersecurity over the last 2 years, been teaching on it. And the thing that I've said is that, probably not the best analogy, but it was always a fun one when I gave this in class, was we know who the Secret Service is, right? And we know they have a big function, but one of the big things about Secret Service, right, they're supposed to protect the president. And the way that they can carry out their job is they know who the president is, right? So if the president is out somewhere, right, and we know that there are people around the president protecting that person because they can identify him, they know who it is. Well, what if you said the Secret Service, you need to protect the president, but we didn't tell you who the president was, right? And so what would happen is you'd have a parade or some event going on. There'd be Secret Service people out there, but the president would be off wandering down some side street without protection because nobody knows who the president is, right? There's no label to know that that's who it is. And that's kind of might be kind of a silly analogy, but that's the way I think about CUI. Is companies spend a lot of money, they put together the best firewall security training, and they do all of this stuff that they're supposed to do. But if you don't actually mark the data, then you don't know what data it is that you're supposed to be protecting.
Well, there are policies being rolled out in the federal government regarding CUI marking. I've attended some of their training. It's been in work for at least 3 years. It'll probably be at least another 3 years or so before it becomes clear. So our guidance to clients is that FCI would be, other than the publicly posted RFP information, anything you're exchanging with the government, your proposal, your quote, any questions back and forth, specific contractual information that they're sending to you that's not posted on their website, it's not on sam.gov, then consider that FCI. It's being exchanged outside of the public realm. If there's technical or personal information being generated or exchanged, then consider that CUI. And it's just generalities to get your hands around it. The other way to think about it is, if you're dealing with a defense contract or you're a subcontractor somewhere in the defense contract chain, then I would just say every piece of information related to that customer project or that program, consider it CUI. That's a little bit of a safe and sorry approach.
Yeah, and that's and I'll say that that's one of the things that we have advised clients. It's something that I teach is, and I don't want to get too far off track here, but people say, okay, do I develop a system where I protect non-CUI data and a separate system to protect CUI? Well, one, now you've got to build and maintain two separate systems, which becomes very likely very expensive, right? If you're going to take that approach, you've got a lot of time and effort to do it. But then one of the other core problems that comes into play is what we've already talked about, is if the information is not labeled, or it's not labeled correctly. Even if you had two systems, then it might end up, right, if it really is CUI, but it's not labeled, it might end up over here in your non-CUI system and may not be protected. Whereas, again, in what you said and what we advise, especially for small companies, just assume that it's, if you're dealing with it, especially the Department of Defense, just assume that it's CUI and set up one system and protect all of the data that one way.
And it doesn't matter whether the DoD produces the information and sends it to you, or as part of your contract, you're supposed to produce the information and provide it back to the government. Doesn't matter who produces it, it all needs to be protected. So, all right, well, so a wrinkle that came up recently is a new DFARS rule, a regulation that's coming out, being effective end of next month, end of November, that is introducing CMMC certification as a regulation. So up until recently, there's been a requirement in the DFARS for what's called NIST compliance. NIST is the National Institute of Standard and Technology, and they have a document that has these similar requirements in it. And up until now, it's been an honor system, basically, that you self-attest that you're meeting those requirements. All of that is gradually being replaced by a formal third-party certification called CMMC. In order for that to be a legally binding requirement, contractually binding requirement, the regulation had to be updated. That regulation has been posted. It is being put into effect November 30th. That's this long-term issue over here on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side was the surprise. The surprise was, oh, by the way, NIST is not going away. These related requirements, similar but related but not identical requirements called NIST SB 800-171, they are requiring not just self-attestation, which means you sign on your contract saying, hey, we're in compliance or we're working toward compliance, but you actually go through a self-assessment and score your system and supply the government the score, the rating, if you will, how many points you scored on the self-assessment. That's the part on the left-hand side. So that self-assessment score, as of November 30th, or beyond November 30th, I guess that would be December 1st, in order to be eligible to be awarded a contract or a contract renewal or contract extension, you have to conduct the self-assessment and submit the score to the Department of Defense. We'll provide more information on that here in a moment. And so it's no longer a, hey, trust me, I've got this kind of situation, but it's go through and evaluate your system and provide to us how well you align with 800-171. And if you have gaps, by what date are you going to get those gaps closed? So
yeah, up until now, the DoD has kind of taken this step back approach of saying, and I kind of warned people of this a couple of years ago, right? So when you sign a contract with any contract, right? But when you're signing a contract with the government, you're agreeing with all the clauses in there. You're saying we are compliant with all of these clauses.
Yeah.
And what we knew was happening, what we know is happening, what I know is happening with some of our clients right now, and it's happening with tens of thousands of contractors, is they know they're not fully compliant. The government knows they're not fully compliant. They're signing this, they're accepting it, they're moving forward, because when we were waiting for the original DFARS clause to go into play, and there was this concern about, well, is the government contracting community going to come to a screeching halt? Well, we knew the government wasn't going to let that happen. Yeah. But now, unfortunately, what they've seen over the nearly 3 years now that the DFARS rule has been in play officially, they're realizing there are problems. You know, CMMC was supposed to be the solution, and I think it is a better long-term solution, but DoD has also realized it's taking them longer to implement that than what they originally thought. So now they've got this stopgap measure in place, which, as you said, Scott, was really a bit of a surprise to most of us in industry. We were not expecting this to come out with the interim rule.
Yeah, well, and I think we'll show you guys the link where you can download that assessment document and start to get familiar with it. And of course, the government's point of view, it's a little disingenuous, Robert, if you ask me, but it's, hey, you've already been signing that you're in compliance. all we're asking you to do is go through a 15-minute exercise, fill out this form, send in the score, and you're done. But
Not that simple.
not that simple. But on the CMMC side, of course, longer term, there would be the requirement to have a formal certification in place in the future. So the present requirement, starting December 1st, is this self-assessment score being submitted. The longer term requirement, as soon as you see CMMC certification being required in an RFP that you're bidding on, so your customer would notify you that a CMMC certification is required for a particular contract, then you'll have to submit or have your certificate. I don't know if you submit the certificate or at least
Yeah,
they can look and see if you're certified, I guess is the way.
Yeah.
But in any case, this is kind of this, it's all on the same path. It's all on the same critical path, and doing the right things now to address this assessment will put you in a great place to work towards certification. I think that's probably the best way to think about the relationship here. So the requirements for the assessment, again, after December 1st, to be awarded a contract, you would complete the self-assessment using DoD scoring. The part of that is to develop a written plan for how you have complied with the NIST 800-171 requirements, develop a plan to address that, otherwise known as a POAM, with dates, commitments to get those things done. And then those 4 items are what gets submitted. Theoretically, it's a 15-minute exercise, but to get ready to do that 15 minutes of work might take a few weeks. Let's just say.
Well, and you know, so to step back objectively, you know, if you want to look at this from, I think what DoD is looking at, they're saying, hey, this clause, we've been talking about the DFARS clause since 2013. Yeah. It was 2015, I think, when the first actual version of it came out, the end of 2017 when it went into effect. And so I think DoD is saying, you really should already have this stuff done. If you're signing government contracts, you should, even if you're not completely compliant with 110 items, you should have your SSP and your POAM. And so, you know, submitting it from that perspective, submitting it might in theory be a 15-minute exercise. But unfortunately, again, you and I and Andrew all know reality, clients aren't there. They're just not there.
It costs time and money. Yeah. So, and even before you spend time and spend money, there's this learning gap, to really understand what are they really asking for, because the documentation they provide is not that clear. I mean, it's in these generalities, I guess. It's somewhat vague. So there's a lot of interpretation. And of course, if you've been through audits like ISO audits and other kinds of audits, you know, auditor interpretation has a bearing on the result. And so that's an aspect of preparing, is to get proper training so you understand the interpretation and then apply it appropriately in as simple a manner as possible in your business.
Sure.
So, and then they also threw in this little kicker that the DCMA, which I think if you're a government contractor, you're familiar with those great people who spend a week in your conference room rifling through paper and other types of things. They're saying that on occasion they could do some spot checking of these self-assessments. So it's again, they're trying to march everybody down a path, and this is a step. Yeah. Here's the link if you want to download the assessment methodology, the scoring that I mentioned to you a moment ago. It's worth looking over, reviewing it, make a list of things that are obvious gaps. Sit down with your IT professional, whether internal or third party, or call Andrew and help you walk it through. So, all right. So who does this apply to? Robert, you want to talk a bit about some of these, when we talk about now pivoting from the assessment for NIST to the CMMC certification itself? Let's talk through some of those basics.
Yeah, so what I think is one of the nice things about CMMC, and I do believe that CMMC is a good long-term solution. We'll talk about some of the levels of it later. I think that was one of the problems with the current DFARS NIST approach, was that it was this one-size-fits-all. Obviously, the government is still pushing towards that with this assessment, saying you got to meet all 110 items. The CMMC gives you a different approach based upon some risk factors, right, to deal with that. One of the other problems that CMMC solves, and this was something, again, I said for the last few years about the current approach, was that there was no certification. It was you were self-certifying. There was no requirement until this new interim rule to really submit anything. Now, we do know there were some critical programs that the government did get SSPs and POAMs from contractors because of the criticality of a program, but that was a fraction of a percentage of overall contracts out there. Now, again, the interim rule is changing that. The long-term rule is that now there truly is a certification, right? And that involves an outside party. That means somebody else is coming in and going to score me based upon some objective criteria. And I think the thing to point out here, part of what, again, our goal for today's topic, it's that last bullet with the 3 sub-bullets. This is a huge effort. Again, I wish I could take all of the previous classes and webinars and stuff that I've taught on this and condense it down to today. I said, when you create your previous gap matrix, if you had taken the 110 items and put them in Excel, which is what we and some other consultants did, gave it to people at least as a starting point, right, start to work through here. We told people one of the columns in your chart needs to be responsible party. However, you cannot say, oh, we'll put Andrew from IT on all of them. This is an IT problem. Andrew will solve it. No, it's not an IT problem. Mm-hmm. IT is certainly a portion of this. Management's involved. There's policies and procedures that guide what Andrew and other people will do. But those are policies and procedures that, again, are developed and maintained by management that are then implemented by Andrew and other people. You also have other people in your organization. If you've got an industrial security person, if you've got people who are dealing with visitors and the visitor log and how that's handled, all of those types of things flow into the security of the data and your systems, so they become a piece of this. Don't take that list again and assign one person. It's multiple people. And in fact, it's very likely multiple internal and external resources, again, is what we're here to talk about today, is that, from our perspective at Left Brain Professionals, and we've got a slide later, I'm probably jumping too far ahead, but part of our role is government contract compliance at a whole. We have a very specific interest in the accounting aspect of it. Again, we're concerned because our clients are government contractors. You've got somebody like Scott and his team who come in and do the readiness, right? They help you evaluate the gaps, help you evaluate, are your policies, procedures appropriate? Are you on the right track? What needs to be done? And then you get somebody like Andrew who comes in as a managed service provider that says, okay, he's working with Scott saying, okay, here's the gap that's been identified. Andrew is going to work with you to figure out what the exact technical solution is and help you implement that technical solution, who then tosses it back to Scott and his team to look at and say, okay, here's the solution you implemented. Does it really meet the requirements that are listed out here? And to be fair, again, they're also going to be working with your internal people. It's most likely, if you're a very small company, you might work strictly with somebody like an Andrew, who they might be doing. You might, again, have that external managed service provider who's actually doing your IT management. That's what actually Andrew does for us. He does all that stuff for us. But you may have your own internal IT person who's working with somebody else on the outside. So again, just keep in mind that our title here today is a village, and it really is a village to make this happen.
So all of those people will have to be involved is our point.
Yep.
And getting everyone up to the same level of understanding is really the starting point there. And then throughout the preparation, keeping everybody involved throughout that process. When the auditor's on site, the auditor can and will talk to various people, so everyone will have to be prepared. And then, of course, it's a recertification every 3 years. So yep. Just like an ISO certification, you'd have to maintain everything after the audit. Same kind of thing here. Same kind
yep.
of thing. So Robert alluded to this issue of levels, and there are 5 levels of certification available. You would not get certified to all 5. There's going to be a level generally that would be applicable to you and the contracts you pursue. And all that is based on the kind of information that how sensitive the information is. that you're dealing with regard to the government contract. So if you have very non-sensitive information, let's say you provide a service of some sort, you work on a military base providing construction, you provide other kinds of support services, you might only need a level 1 certification because the nature of the information wouldn't necessarily put our war fighters at risk. But the more sensitive weapon systems, a lot of the information regarding equipment and other types of things that are used in a warfighting situation, that's going to be more sensitive. It might require a level 3 or even a level 5 certification. So if that's the reason for the different levels, and of course, the bigger the number, the level, the more complicated it gets, I think, Robert, isn't that right?
Yeah, and one thing we do want to make clear is that everybody doing business with DoD will have to be to level 1. Again, that really ties back again to the FAR clause. The FAR clause was in all the contracts, has been for a while. You should have already been compliant with it. So that's how DoD and why DoD is saying you got to be compliant with level 1. As Scott said, there are 5 levels. Remember earlier when I said there was the current rule, and I have to say the current rule, right? Because the current rules were still following the DFARS, which is that NIST 800-171, the 110 items. That's that one-size-fits-all approach that isn't working well. And that's why a lot of companies are struggling. One of the nice things about CMMC and what it brings to us, as Scott said, depending on the type of products or service that you're providing, the sensitivity of the information related, you don't have to jump through and get an extra large shirt, right? I mean, a guy like me, who shows up to the race and I get there late, right? And I'm picking out my t-shirt and the only thing left is a 3X. Well, it doesn't really fit me really well, right? And that's the way a lot of government contractors feel right now. That goes away with CMMC, and it's a building process. So the nice thing is you get level 1, work on that now, get that under your belt. If you decide, hey, we're going to pursue other types of contracts and there's going to be other things involved, when you go after level 3, as an example, then you're just adding on to what you've already had. And again, same thing if you get in a situation and need a level 4 or level 5.
Yeah, but I think who does this apply to? Well, as you said, it applies to anyone, anywhere in the defense industrial base at whatever level subcontractor you might be. If you're receiving any payments related to any defense contract, then at least level 1 is applicable.
Yeah.
The answer to which level really is your customer will determine that. So even now is a good thing to do, is to contact some of your defense customers and start the conversation and say, what do you expect for this contract or this program? What level certification might be expected in the future?
And I think a good simple gauge for many DoD contractors, if you're dealing with something where there's a drawing, a bill of material kind of stuff, it's pretty clear that's CUI, you're going to have to meet level 3. Yeah. And most of you already know that if you're in that space.
Levels 4 and 5, they're expecting less than 1% of all 300,000 defense contractors would need a level 4 or 5. So it's primarily, you're looking at the first 3 levels as the likely target, I guess you would say. But your customer would be able to answer the question of what to expect. But so let's drill into the level 1, and we'll put Andrew on the spot here just a bit. What I did here, Andrew, was I took the 17 level 1 requirements and just summarized them into a few categories here. Those numbers in parentheses say this is the number of requirements in each of these categories. And I thought we ought to, for those who aren't all that technical and want to know, gee, do we have this in place? How do I know if we have this in place? Who do I talk to about it? Let's start with that one in the middle, user accounts and passwords. What are the kinds of things that a company would have to have in place at level 1 for user accounts and passwords?
Yeah, that's a great question, Scott. So, as Robert has alluded, and I think you've alluded to as well, Scott, most of the businesses that we interact with, smaller businesses, we find they don't have Active Directory. They don't have a central platform for administration of user accounts and passwords. So things very seemingly simple things for a larger business. Somebody gets terminated, somebody changes a role, somebody changes a position. If you have Active Directory or you have some form of aggregate directory, you have the ability at an instant to change that person's role, to change that person's access. If you don't have a domain and you don't have a centralized management system for user accounts and passwords, well, then it's a little bit harder, right? And there's certain gaps that we can accomplish as a managed service provider to handle those things. But from the standpoint of the CMMC level 1, that's kind of a high level thing. Is if you don't have Active Directory, look into Azure Active Directory, look into some form of system where you can pull all of your user account data in and be able to manage it at a moment's notice, so that if there is something that happens, you can respond to it immediately and take action, document it, and reflect towards CMMC level 1.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And the foundation of any of these levels is this security family they call access control, and you're controlling who can access what, and how do I know you are who you say you are when you're accessing this information, and all of that is handled through the accounts and passwords, right?
Correct.
So,
yeah, and like you say, various levels and needs, obviously tailored to your organization. But that's the core minimum: is can you respond to something that's happening within your organization in a matter of time to protect the government's interest and your interest? And if the answer is no, then there's got to be a change there made so that you can do that.
Yeah, and we could drill into all of these different areas. I would encourage, I'll give you guys the link to where you could download the requirements and read through the 17 controls for level 1. From an IT point of view, these are very much blocking and tackling kinds of things. But for many small companies who don't have an IT resource, this might be somewhat of a lift to put these things in place. So I think it kind of depends on where you're starting from as to the level of complexity here.
Exactly.
All right, very good. So level 1, some tips here. Here's a link where you can download the CMMC model, which is the standard that the auditor will use to certify you. It's a lengthy document. Is that an understatement, Robert? It's a lengthy document.
Yeah.
200 or 300 pages. I mean, there's a lot of examples and such toward the back of it. But if you just drill into page 12, I put the page numbers right here, you'll see how they've laid out those 17 requirements and be able to kind of go through like a checklist and say, gee, we're in good shape here, or I don't even know what they're talking about there, or maybe we're out of date over here. But I think that would be a great way to get started.
Yeah. And I always recommend that your owners and executives need to read those kinds of things too. They may not be technical people. They don't have to read all 300 pages and try to interpret and understand what that is, but they need to understand what are the 17 requirements, right? What are the basic things that we're trying to solve?
Yep, that's right. That's right. All right, now we're going to jump to level 3. The reason is what the DoD is saying is level 2 is a transitionary level. What that means is they're not planning to specify level 2 in contracts, at least currently. They're planning to specify level 1 or 3 for most contracts, and level 2 being a milestone you can use to get to 3. So that's why we're jumping right up to level 3. So Andrew, let's come back to you here. We now expanded the list from 17 to 130. I didn't feel like 130 things on the screen were going to be too useful. So we organized it into the domains, what they call the domains, or what used to be called the families, the topics, if you will. What are a couple of these that you feel a small business might need to really focus on?
It's a great question again, and I think, you know, from our standpoint, when we work with businesses, awareness and training, and it kind of alludes back to what Robert was saying, is when going after all of these things, and if I can give some advice here on this call, sometimes reading a 400-page thing as an executive is not something the executive has time for, but it behooves anybody who's working in the organization who's tasked with it to give a Cliff Notes version, so that you can get buy-in, because without buy-in at the top, nothing's going to make it back down to the bottom. So awareness and training is a huge piece of this. A lot of this is based in policy, which is what Scott can help you do. But having awareness training, having an incident response plan, having actually tested those things, testing your controls to make sure that they actually work, so they're not just on paper in a binder somewhere. And like Scott said on the CMMC 1 slide, almost everything is about security controls, and that goes across the board, whether it's IT related, finance related, contract related, whatever it is. But all of it kind of does pull back to IT because, well, where do you store your accounting related data? Well, that system has to be secured with least privilege access, with restrictions on who can access it, when they can access it, all of those things. And like I said, I'll go right out there and say a lot of the small businesses we work with, they're not there yet, right? Mm-hmm. They're trying to work on their business, not in their business to get more business. They want more business, but they don't have the time or resources to dedicate to this. So those are two big ones that I would bring up just from that standpoint. Is awareness and training is huge, because putting things in and not having anybody know how they work or know what the purpose or function of them are doesn't lead to high adoption or compliance.
Yeah, to some degree, that's your starting point, right there, and that's very good summary. One nice thing is if you've been working toward NIST compliance, you've already been exposed to 110 of these 130, because all 110 of the NIST 800-171 have been rolled in here. So you're talking about 20 more, basically, in terms of controls. So Robert, there are, as we said, two different groups or individuals within an organization that needs to step up here, right?
Yeah, you know, what Andrew said, reiterated me, was management's got to define the policies, right? They can work with you, Scott, and your team of what is an appropriate policy. And some of those do vary by organizations, right? We certainly have guidelines to go by, but sometimes we have to adjust them as appropriate for a specific organization. But management's got to own that, right? Management's got to take the lead and make the decision of how they want to handle those things. And then that's when it flips over to the technical people, you know, again, probably a combination of an external and an internal IT resource who figure out how to implement those, right? So, you know, for example, if and I'm just going to make up something, management says, we're going to require passwords be 12 characters long and they have to have whatever, you know, is in there. And that's our policy of how we're going to do passwords. You know, the management has to make that decision, and then IT has to carry it out. Now, there's also there's got to be communication in there, right? So your technical people are going to be providing input and guidance to management. And again, I can say, because Andrew is our MSP and work with him, oftentimes I go and say, okay, Andrew, I know what the problem is, and I know, you know, I know what the regulations say about how we're supposed to do it, but how do we really make this happen, right? So your technical people can certainly provide you input on how to address these items.
Well, and we're fortunate that Andrew has exposure and experience to the security side and to these requirements in particular. But I'd say, Andrew, you're the exception, not the rule. I think it's not, especially with a lot of small businesses, they have somebody in-house who's part-time working on IT, or they have an MSP, local MSP that handles, you know, the back end of their network and all that kind of thing. That doesn't necessarily mean they have the knowledge of the security requirements and the solutions from a technical point of view that need to be implemented. They may not have had any exposure to those things in any real way. So training of the technical folks, training of the management, both are foundational here. All right, with that, let me talk through one other aspect of this requirement, and it's under the heading of maturity, which means how well can you convince the auditor that you've incorporated these security controls into your day-to-day business life? Are these things that you've just bolted on or put in last week and nobody's really following them, or you don't have any evidence that they're being managed or effectively implemented, what they call institutionalizing them? Then that's the maturity side. And with a level 3, they're saying that the practices, the controls, need to be well managed. They need to, at level 2, be documented. At level 1, you have to actually perform them. But there's the auditor will be looking not only are these things in place, but are they being effective? And if they feel that they're not being effective, they may only rate you at a level 2 or a level 1. even though you might have all 130 controls in place, if you will. So it's just a caution, don't wait till the last minute. This does take a runway to get prepared for. All right, so to get started with level 3, I think, looking for resources that have experience with these certifications, I think is a starting point. I mean, obviously, we're here as professionals explaining how to approach this, and we'll talk a little bit about the support we can provide. We can certainly fill that gap, or you may have someone that you're working with now that has experience with cybersecurity certifications that you could rely on, but make sure you get the right support. I guess is step 1. Conduct this assessment. It's a little more complicated than the 17 controls I mentioned earlier. You can use the DoD assessment tool to get 110 of them looked at, and then the other 20 take a look at that. But you're really trying to develop a plan to address these requirements and form a budget for all of this, because more than likely there's going to be some expenses ahead. All right, timeline. Where are we, Robert, with regard to how this is rolling out into industry?
Well, it's an interesting question. As I said, I've been dealing with this and following it primarily since 2013. We watched when the original DFARS rule came out in 2015, and the government pushed and changed, and there was industry feedback. That's kind of adjusted how this played out. When DoD rolled out CMMC last year, this idea of it was like, oh, it'll all be done by the end of 2020 and life will be happy and grand. And all of us in the industry went, no, we don't think it's going to work like that. And, and it took, it even took them getting the CMMC accreditation board up and running longer than they thought. And in fact, the accreditation board is not where they are. And part of the reason I tell you that story is that, and again, if you're used to dealing with the government, it's not a big surprise that that's kind of how it works. But it means that this is constantly changing. We've generally known the big rule. I mean, we've kind of known where we've been headed for a while, but it hasn't gone on exactly the same path as they thought. And as we said, with the interim rule that came out that we have here, right, today is October 22nd, right? We're kind of in that middle where Scott has us plotted down there. By the end of next month, the interim rule is supposed to take effect. I would caution to say there's a possibility they may push out that date. There's been some talk about that. Don't bank on it, but I wouldn't be surprised if, based upon some feedback, DoD comes back and says, okay, we're going to push back that date to maybe January, February, or some other time. That doesn't mean you can wait until now, January or February, to deal with it, right? But it may change. The current, what we're looking at right now is we're expecting the assessments to begin in January of 2021. And we know that the rollout across all contracts, DoD finally, I think, came to their senses a while back and realized this is a 5 or 6 year effort, right? This is not an overnight make it happen. I will note that, we've had clients, we've had some PTAC clients that we worked with who've said, we've been seeing the CMMC requirements in our RFPs for a while. If you haven't seen that actual requirement show up in your RFPs yet, it's probably coming. And I think really the takeaway from this slide is you got to keep your eyes open and your ears to the ground about what is happening and what that timeline is.
Yeah, I would agree, but I think the time is now to get started on that self-assessment, because that's going to give you perspective as to how big of a lift is this going to be from that point forward. And that's available now. So I think it's,
we know what the requirements are, right? We know what the 130 requirements are for level 3. There's absolutely no reason for you to delay trying to figure out what your gaps are.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Well, so generally, I'm going to try to generalize a bit. We've been working with small businesses now for a year, about a year, because it's only been available specifically for that period of time. But we've really helped seeing that there's kind of 3 phases, if you will, to getting prepared for a certification. And you would expect this to be true of any kind of a compliance effort within your organization. If you're having to upgrade your quality system to an ISO 9001, for example, you'd probably use these same 3 blocks. If you've been through it, you know kind of what would be expected in terms of the effort here. But it does start with learning and assessment. That's for your technology team or individual and your management team. That aspect of it results in a written assessment so that, number one, you can have that score that you need for the DFARS compliance, but then also gives you that plan of action to start closing gaps. And formulating the budget for what is ahead is a key part of it. Can we answer today, what is this going to cost? I can say no, we absolutely don't, because it depends on where you're starting from. And so that's the place to begin. But an expectation you'd have there in phase 1 is that you'd have a roadmap and a budget to work from at that point. Then you're into the remediation phase, all the improvements and upgrades. This is where the money will be spent, I guess is the way you'd say it. This is where time is going to be spent. This is how you start to build that maturity aspect of it, where you start to get these improvements in place, and then you're ready for certification when the time comes. That'll depend on that requirement. It'll depend on when your contracts, RFPs start to indicate that certain certifications are required. But starting January, they'll have auditors available. I'm going to say they have a handful of auditors available now, 50 or 60, something in that range. But they're planning to expand that to the hundreds to support 300,000 companies that have to get certified in the next 5 years. So you would expect that training to continue so they can conduct those third-party audits. There will be an opportunity after a certification audit to correct errors or gaps. I think there's a 60-day window is what they've talked about, Robert, up to this point. But I think if you're heading toward a level 1 and you're expecting to need certification there, give yourself a 2 or 3 month window. If you're thinking level 3, give yourself a 6 to 9 month window. So you can see if you're expecting CMMC certification to appear in one of your contracts in 2021, then it's time to get started, certainly. So hopefully that gives you a sense of what might be involved. Now, where we could help is displayed here. Generally, what we'll do, and we'll start with a business advisor working with our client to really help identify the need, think through the long-term strategic needs and objectives. How does compliance and certification fit? What level certification might we be expecting? And that's where left-brain professionals can help. They're great at looking at that long-term perspective and help with working through that strategic plan. That'll kind of give you the outline, I guess, of where to go from here. Now, once a client contacts us and says, "Hey, we'd really like your help," we often ask our clients to assign 2 people to work with our consultants. Client would assign a project lead. Typically, it's a member of management that's going to kind of represent the management side, and then a technical lead. And if you don't have someone who has the qualifications to be that technical lead, then that's where Andrew can step up and provide that guidance and direction from a technical point of view, keeping a clear eye on the fact that you're a small business and you don't have the resources that Lockheed Martin does. I mean, we all recognize that. So having to right size those solutions is key. And then we assign a management consultant and a technical consultant. So there's a team of 4 that kind of march through the process. With that, Robert, we have a bit of time here to take questions. And it looks like we have at least one in the Q&A. If you guys want to pop some questions in there, we are very glad to address that.
Yeah, so, and the one thing that I would just want to go back to some of what you were saying, Scott, about, budget and time and kind of roles of people. we're a small business, right? This country is fueled by small business. I don't know the exact stats, but I don't know, something probably like 90% of the country is fueled by small businesses, and many of those with, maybe only a few $100,000 of revenue, maybe only a handful of employees. I know certainly we have a number of clients in that space. Andrew and Scott have a number of clients of that size, right? Even if they're a few $1,000,000 in revenue, they still may only have 20 or 30 employees. And oftentimes they don't have a full-time IT resource, right? So they do need somebody like an Andrew to come in and help with that.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And companies will start at different places. Some will have been working on security for a while. Some will be, glad that their network hasn't gone down this week, or have tried to go to the cloud and are kind of partway between that transition, or wherever you are to start. That's where this team approach, this village approach, Robert, that you introduced as the title of this session here, I think that's key. And we're able to come alongside you and your clients to put a practical plan together, working toward certification when the time comes. So if you guys have questions beyond today, we're going to put our contact information up here momentarily, and we'll be glad to get back to you. Last thing we have here, just as we're working toward the end of our session here, is to talk a bit about cost. We're not going to be able to give you guys a quote on what it's going to cost to upgrade your network and put all these controls in place, because again, it depends on your situation. But you can see here, there are a number of factors, if you will, that lend themselves toward higher or lower cost, I guess is the way. Like a level 3 is going to cost generally more than a level 1 certification. If you have a large number of devices, that's going to be more expensive generally than if you have just a handful. These are kind of just generalities. I think the older and newer equipment thing can come into play. If you've been maintaining your equipment and it's all fairly current, it probably has the capabilities that maybe just need configuration in some places. So just wanted to make this available to you guys. We'll make sure you get copies of the slides so you could read through this list at a later time. And I'm going to zoom past my animation here, Robert. Forgive me for that. Just to get to our contact information, we more than glad to take questions. Feel free to contact Robert or I at any time to ask questions, either phone or email. Glad to help you guys work through, put a plan in place. I guess that's the big message here, Robert, is it's a planning step right now.
It is, and I think one of the things that we should have said early on, this is again something we've always advised our clients on. It's a process, right? This is not something that happens overnight. It's something that takes weeks, months. Even as you said, when you're going for the higher level certifications, it's going to take several months. My general caution would be, I can tell you that we've run into some other consultants out there who unfortunately take the government's approach of one size fits all, do it all and do it all now. And it's just not a realistic approach. And I would say if you run into somebody like that, step back, reassess, and realize this is a bite-sized approach. I mean, we've been working with Andrew even on our stuff for several months, and there are different reasons for that. Again, some of it comes back to budget, right? I mean, even though we were doing a lot of the right stuff, there were some things that we had to buy, some things that we had to do, right? And companies don't have an endless bucket of money, right, to throw at solving some of these kinds of problems. We have to step back and say, okay, I can only afford so much money for consultants and so much money for equipment to solve these problems, right? I'm going to have to break it up over months or even a couple of fiscal years, as an example.
Yeah, there's another aspect to that is change, because you're asking people to change how they do things in many regards, and sometimes that's the obstacle.
And it really is. I was going to say, with any compliance program, I will tell you that what we find, because in theory, right, we can read the requirements. They're pretty objective, pretty easy to understand. At least if you're technical, we kind of know what the general solutions are. Andrew will say, hey, you need to put in an Active Directory. Sounds like an easy solution. Andrew, how easy is it? not always that easy, right? Especially if you've got a bunch of people out there with PCs that aren't on the Active Directory,
Yeah.
getting them migrated, getting all the profiles and stuff set up, it just takes time. Yeah.
All right. Well, Robert, I think that's our topic for today. We've come to the top of the hour. It was great to meet with you guys. Appreciate the opportunity again.
Thank you to both of you. I appreciate it.
Thank you both.
And thank you guys for joining us here today. You've got our contact information here. We'll be sure to get you guys copies of these slides afterward. And Robert, Andrew, everyone else, thank you so much for being with us today. We'll wish you to all the health and all the success as you move forward. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, everybody.